The desert wind howled like a wounded animal, whipping sand against the wooden planks of the tiny frontier settlement. Maren Dalton pressed her fingers to the rough bark of a mesquite tree, heart hammering as she scanned the horizon. A figure emerged from the shimmering heat waves, muscles rippling under a worn leather vest, eyes sharp as obsidian. She knew the stories, the Apache warrior who roamed these lands, feared by settlers and revered by some for his unmatched skill with bow and blade. And yet, nothing could have prepared her for the heat that shot through her chest the moment he locked eyes on her. "I can't control myself around you," the man said, his voice low, thick with warning, yet edged with a raw intensity that made her knees weak. Maren's breath caught. His words were not the boast of a villain, but the confession of someone wrestling with the force. He could not master her presence. The town behind her seemed distant, insignificant. The dusty streets, the creaking signs, the watchful neighbors all faded under the intensity of the warrior's gaze. He stepped closer, and the scent of sun-warmed leather and earth clung to him like a second skin. His long black hair, tangled and wild, framed a face carved by years of survival and battle. Tribal beads and bone necklaces glinted in the fading sunlight, marking him as otherworldly, untamed, dangerous. "Step back," he warned, hand hovering over the knife at his belt. "If you come any closer, I won't be responsible for what happens." Maren's pulse raced, a mix of fear and undeniable curiosity. She had heard whispers from travelers and traders stories of his bravery, his ferocity, his near mythical presence in the wilds. And yet, now, standing mere feet away from him, she felt something else entirely, a magnetic pull that rooted her in place. She began, then faltered. Words felt useless against the storm in his eyes. "She," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "I won't hurt you if you trust me." The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the cracked earth. Maren knew the danger of lingering in the open after dark. Bandits, wolves, or worse could strike without warning. Yet she found herself unable to move, unable to turn her back on the warrior whose very presence ignited both fear and desire in equal measure. Finally, with a reluctant sigh, he gestured toward the edge of the tree line. "My cabin," he said. "It's not far, and it's safe for tonight. After that, you'll have to make your own choices." The words were a lifeline and a trap all at once. Maren glanced back at the settlement one last time. She could run, find the safety of familiar faces and predictable routines. But something in her chest, a thrill, a recklessness, a spark she couldn't name, pushed her forward. The warrior led the way, moving with the grace of a predator, yet his every motion was careful, measured, as if he feared that one wrong step might shatter the fragile tension between them. Maren followed, heart pounding, lungs burning with the dry desert air, knowing that whatever awaited her in that small cabin could change everything. And for the first time in her life, she did not fear the unknown. The path to the cabin twisted through the desert like a narrow vein of shadow, flanked by jagged rocks and scrubby brush that scratched at Maren's arms. Every step brought a mix of anticipation and dread, her pulse echoing in her ears louder than the wind rattling through the cacti. The Apache warrior walked ahead, each movement deliberate, almost feline, his bare chest gleaming with sweat under the sinking sun. The scent of earth and leather clung to him, an intoxicating, wild perfume that made her stomach tighten. "You don't have to be afraid," he said without turning. His voice was low, steady, carrying a weight she couldn't measure. "But you need to listen. There are rules in my cabin. Boundaries." Maren swallowed hard. She had expected danger. Yes, but not this raw honesty, this declaration of restraint that seemed almost intimate. I understand," she whispered, though she wasn't entirely sure she did. A hawk cried overhead, a sharp piercing sound that made her flinch. He glanced up briefly, eyes narrowing, then returned his gaze forward. The desert was quiet, but Maren sensed movement, shadows flitting across the rocks like silent watchers. She felt exposed, vulnerable, and yet oddly protected by the presence of this towering figure before her. Finally, the cabin came into view, a rough-hewn structure of timber and stone, smoke curling from the chimney. It seemed impossibly small. In the vast desert, yet it radiated a sense of safety, a promise of refuge. He slowed as they approached, glancing back at her with a sharp intensity that made her stomach flutter. "Inside," he said. "Close the door behind you. Don't touch anything unless I tell you. And sit where I can see you." Maren's hands trembled as she obeyed, brushing dust from the hem of her skirt. The interior was dim, lit by the dying glow of a small fire. Shadows danced along the walls, throwing the warrior's muscular silhouette into stark relief. He moved to the fire, crouching low to tend it, and she noticed the scars that ran across his shoulders and forearms, each a story of battles survived, dangers faced and sacrifices made. "You're staring," he said suddenly, not accusing, just stating a fact. His tone held no mockery, only an edge of awareness, as if he could read the truth in her gaze. I didn't mean to," Maren said, cheeks burning. She couldn't look away. There was something mesmerizing in the way he moved, the way his muscles flexed even in the smallest gestures. Even his silence carried a magnetic power. He chuckled softly, a low, gravelly sound that resonated through the cabin. "You don't have to hide it. Few women have ever been near me like this. And most who try regret it." Maren's heart pounded harder, a confusing tangle of fear and fascination. "Why me?" she asked, voice barely audible over the crackle of the fire. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he handed her a small, worn blanket. "Sit, rest. You'll need it for tonight. The desert. It doesn't forgive weakness." Maren wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, the coarse wool warm against her skin. As she sat on the rough plank floor, she realized how thoroughly her senses had been hijacked by this man. His mere presence made the air heavier, the shadows deeper, the desert outside both more menacing and strangely alluring. For the first time, she understood that the night ahead would not be ordinary. The warrior was a storm contained within a puffin. Single body untamed, dangerous, yet bound by a code she could sense but not fully comprehend. And somehow she had stepped directly into that storm. The sun disappeared completely behind the distant mesas, plunging the cabin into semi-darkness. Maren's pulse raced as she heard him move to the window, peering out into the desert, ever vigilant. She felt both invisible and intensely observed, as if every beat of her heart was mirrored in his own. And though she told herself she must remain cautious, a tiny spark of something forbidden and exhilarating flickered in her chest. She knew that by morning everything would be different, because tonight she was in his world, under his rules, and entirely at his mercy. The fire crackled. The wind whispered outside. And Maren realized with a thrill and a chill that nothing, neither fear, nor desire, nor survival, would ever be simple again. Night had fallen completely, and the desert outside the cabin seemed to hold its breath. Maren sat on the floor, the coarse blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders, trying to steady her racing pulse. The firelight flickered across the warrior's bare chest as he moved with quiet precision, sharpening a long knife. The sound of metal against stone was oddly hypnotic, each spark reflecting in his dark, intense eyes. "You can't imagine the things that roam out there," he said without looking at her. "Wolves, coyotes, men with worse intentions." His voice was low and steady, carrying both warning and a hint of something deeper, something unspoken. Maren nodded, though her thoughts were tangled. distracted by the heat radiating from his body and the way his muscles flexed as he worked. I trust you," she said, surprising herself with the words. He paused, a spark of surprise crossing his expression. Then, almost imperceptibly, the corners of his mouth lifted. "Few do," he admitted, "and fewer still, willingly." The cabin was quiet except for the fire and the occasional groan of timber settling under the desert's chill. Maren felt the tension between them tighten, a silent current crackling in the small space. Her eyes traced the contours of his shoulders, the sharp line of his jaw, and the long hair that fell like a dark waterfall over his back. Every detail was seared into her mind, each movement amplified by the closeness of the room. "Why did you help me?" she asked finally, unable to hold back. Her voice was barely more than a whisper, carried on a tremor of fear and curiosity. He stopped sharpening the knife and looked at her, eyes holding hers with a weight that made her stomach lurch. "Because it was the right thing to do," he said simply, "and because you were in danger I could not ignore." Maren felt warmth rush through her at the sincerity in his voice. But beneath that warmth was a storm, a realization that being here, in his presence, was dangerous in ways she couldn't yet define. He was strength and danger wrapped into one, a man shaped by the desert, by battle, by survival. And she was utterly unprepared for the pull he had on her, the way her thoughts refused to obey her. He sheathed the knife and moved to the small window, looking out into the star-studded desert. The moonlight cast silver highlights on his skin, accentuating the lines of muscle and the tribal jewelry that adorned him. For a moment, he seemed less human, more a creature of the wild, perfectly attuned to the harsh beauty around him. "You'll need to sleep soon," he said, not taking his eyes off the desert. "The night is long, and the desert is unforgiving." Maren shivered, but not entirely from cold. I don't know how I'll rest," she admitted, "not with all of this." Her hands gestured vaguely to the air between them, the tension, the unspoken desire. He turned to her then, and for the first time, the carefully maintained barrier in his eyes softened, just slightly. "Then rest as best you can. But know this," he said, stepping closer, the heat of his body washing over her. "I will not let anything harm you while you are here." Maren's breath caught. His proximity, the raw power in his bare chest, the intensity in his gaze, it was intoxicating. She wanted to reach out, to bridge the small space between them. But fear and propriety held her back. Yet the pull was undeniable, magnetic, a force that made her pulse quicken and her thoughts scatter. The fire crackled, and shadows danced on the walls as the night deepened. The desert outside whispered with it, the sound of wind over sand and the occasional cry of a distant coyote. Inside, the small cabin felt like an island of heat and danger, desire and trust, suspended in a world that had no right to exist this way. Maren realized then that her life had already changed. This night, this cabin, this man, it was a turning point. There would be no returning to safety, no pretending the desert was merely a backdrop to her simple frontier life. And as the warrior moved to stoke the fire again, the light catching the gleam of his tribal jewelry and the sweat on his shoulders, she understood that the night ahead would test her in ways she could not yet imagine. And she wanted it, terrifying as it was. The fire burned lower, casting flickering shadows that danced across the rough timber walls. Maren wrapped the coarse blanket tighter around herself, feeling its warmth barely contain the heat that pooled in her chest. Across the cabin, the Apache warrior sat near the hearth, his bare chest glistening with a sheen of sweat from the day's heat. His tribal jewelry caught the firelight, throwing small sparks of reflected gold and bone into the dim room. "You're quiet," he said, breaking the silence, his voice soft but commanding. "I don't mind, but silence has a way of stretching the night." Maren looked down at her hands, fingers curling into the blanket. I'm trying to understand everything. You, me, this place, the desert." He studied her for a long moment, as if weighing each word. "The desert is honest," he said finally. "It doesn't lie, it doesn't hide, and it doesn't forgive weakness. You've been brave to walk with me here." A shiver ran through her, not entirely from the chill in the cabin. His words were simple, yet they struck a chord in her, a mixture of admiration and something far more intimate. She met his eyes, and in the flickering firelight she saw a depth of emotion she hadn't expected. Beneath the warrior's fierce exterior there was care, even tenderness. "I don't know if I can," she began, then faltered. Her throat tightened as she tried to articulate the storm inside her chest. He leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on his knees, eyes never leaving hers. "You don't have to say it," he said gently. "Actions speak louder than words. And your actions have already told me more than I could ask for." Maren's heartbeat raced. She felt both exposed and seen, the weight of his gaze like a tether holding her in place. She wanted to reach out, to bridge the space between them, but the cabin felt small and the tension thick. Like the air itself had turned to something tangible, something almost electric. Outside, the desert was alive with whispers of wind and the distant call of nocturnal creatures. Inside, the cabin felt like a separate world, timeless, suspended, dangerous. And yet, in that danger, Maren felt a strange comfort. She trusted him, though every instinct screamed caution. He stood suddenly, moving closer to the fire, tossing a few more logs onto the flames. The light surged, illuminating the contours of his chest, the lines of muscle honed from years of survival in the wild. His eyes met hers again, darker now, more intense, and she felt the undeniable pull of desire threading through her fear. "Tonight," he said, voice low, almost a growl, "you will sleep, but sleep with the awareness that I am near, that I am watching, that you are safe, but not entirely alone." Maren's breath caught. She nodded, unable to speak. Her body tingled with the proximity of him, the heat radiating from his bare skin. The raw energy he carried like a storm held in check. He crouched beside her briefly, as if to ensure she was comfortable, then moved back toward the fire. Every movement was deliberate, careful, and yet charged with a power she could not ignore. She could feel the tension lingering, a tightrope between restraint and release, between danger and desire. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the firelight wash over her, trying to calm her racing thoughts. But the scent of him, earth, sweat, leather, was intoxicating. The sound of his breathing, steady and deep, reverberated through the cabin like a drum, syncing with the rapid rhythm of her own pulse. Maren realized then that she had crossed an invisible line. There was no going back to the safety of the settlement, no returning to the life she had known before this night. She had stepped into a world ruled by him, a world of raw power, unpredictability, and undeniable attraction. And as the night stretched on, the desert whispering outside and the fire crackling between them, Maren understood that she was no longer merely a visitor in his cabin. She was part of this moment, part of the storm he carried in his body and soul. And whether she wanted to admit it or not, she was dangerously, irrevocably drawn to him. The shadows deepened, the air thickened, and somewhere between fear and fascination, Maren realized that tonight the desert had claimed her as much as the warrior had. The night deepened, and the desert outside became a black sea, broken only by the occasional glint of distant stars. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned down to glowing embers, sending soft, warm light dancing across the Apache warrior's bare chest. Maren lay on a simple mat, the coarse blanket pulled tight around her, but the warmth of his presence seemed to seep through the fabric, setting her nerves alight. He moved silently around the cabin, checking the locks on the rough wooden door, scanning the window and ensuring that no danger lurked in the darkness beyond. Even in these simple, practical actions, there was a grace that made Maren's pulse quicken. Each movement seemed deliberate, controlled, yet effortless, a predator's poise tempered by care. "You don't have to watch me," she said softly, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I'm not afraid of the desert or of you." He paused, glancing back at her. "I know," he said, his voice calm but edged with intensity, "and I don't expect you to be. But my presence, it changes the rules. Even for someone as brave as you." Maren's heart skipped. She felt exposed under his gaze, yet strangely protected. The tension between them was no longer just about survival. It was an unspoken energy that charged the air, thick and potent. She could feel it in every brush of air, every creak of the cabin, every flicker of firelight that traced the lines of his powerful body. He approached the fire again, crouching low to stoke it, the glow illuminating his long black hair and tribal jewelry. The beads and bone caught the light, scattering tiny sparks that danced across the cabin walls. The sight was mesmerizing. Maren's eyes followed the curve of his muscles, the way his skin glistened with sweat, the subtle power that radiated from every motion. "You're mesmerizing," she admitted, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Her cheeks flamed, but there was no regret, only a strange relief in voicing the truth she could not deny. He looked up sharply, eyes narrowing with a flicker of surprise, then softened. "Few ever say that," he murmured, almost to himself. "Fewer still with sincerity." A sudden gust rattled the cabin door, sending a swirl of sand across the threshold. Maren flinched, and he was immediately at her side, bare hand brushing lightly across her shoulder as he steadied her. The contact, fleeting as it was, made her stomach twist and pulse with heat. "See?" he said, voice low. "Even the desert tests you. It forces you to feel everything." Maren swallowed, trying to steady her trembling hands. I feel everything," she whispered. Her eyes met his, and in that moment, the cabin, the firelight, the desert, they all seemed to vanish, leaving only the raw, undeniable connection between them. He crouched near her again, a careful distance away, and for a long moment neither spoke. The fire crackled, the desert wind whispered outside, and the silence was full of meaning. She could feel the restraint in him, the tight control over something primal and dangerous. And she was drawn to it, craving it, terrified and exhilarated. All at once, finally, he spoke, voice barely above the fire's whisper. "Rest now. You need strength for tomorrow. The desert doesn't forgive weakness, Maren." She nodded, understanding more than the words conveyed. This night, this encounter, had changed her. She could feel the shift deep inside her, in the way her pulse raced, in the way her body responded to him even when logic screamed caution dot as she closed her eyes. Trying to drift into sleep, she realized that the danger, the desire, the tension it was not just in the desert outside. It was here, in the cabin, in the warrior's presence, in the air between them. And she had crossed an invisible line. There was no turning back. The fire dimmed, the shadows deepened, and the desert night stretched on, carrying with it the promise of trials, revelations, and the unspoken bond that had begun to form between them. Maren knew that tomorrow, when the first light of dawn broke over the mesas, everything would be different, and she would never be the same again. The first streaks of dawn crept across the desert sky, painting the mesas in shades of rose and gold. Inside the cabin, Maren stirred beneath her blanket, the warmth of the fire fading but the memory of the warrior's presence still clinging. To her like a second skin, she had slept in fits, half dreaming of the desert wind and the bare-chested figure who had kept vigil beside her. Each movement he had made, each glance exchanged in the dim firelight, replayed in her mind with a clarity that made her pulse quicken. He was already awake when she opened her eyes, kneeling near the small hearth, sharpening a spear with precise, almost meditative motions. The morning light glinted off his long black hair, the tribal beads and bone necklaces catching the soft illumination and scattering tiny reflections across the cabin walls. His muscular frame flexed with each movement, sinews shifting under bronze-toned skin, a living embodiment of the desert's strength and unpredictability. "Morning," he said without looking up, his voice low but carrying a subtle warmth. "Sleep well?" Maren nodded, though her voice caught in her throat. "As well as I could," she admitted, tugging the blanket tighter around her shoulders. She had expected fatigue, but her body hummed with a strange alertness, a tension that refused to ease even after hours of restless rest. He finally looked up, eyes dark and intense, and for a heartbeat she felt like he could see straight into her thoughts. "Good," he said. "We have a long day ahead. The dessert doesn't wait for hesitation." The cabin was quiet except for the soft scrape of the spear against stone and the occasional pop of the dying fire. Maren watched him, captivated by the effortless power in his every motion. She felt herself drawn to him, a pull that was at once terrifying and exhilarating, and tried to steady her racing heart. "Can I help?" she asked softly, almost timidly. He shook his head, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "No, not yet. But soon you will need to learn many things. Survival here is not just about skill, it's about awareness, respect, and trust." Maren's gaze drifted to his bare arms, the way his muscles moved as he worked, and she swallowed hard. The attraction was undeniable, yet she reminded herself to focus, to respect the boundaries he had set. And yet, the heat in her chest, the rapid flutter of her pulse, betrayed her rational mind. He paused in his work, setting the spear down, and finally turned his full attention to her. "You need food," he said, his voice firmer now. "The desert takes strength from the weak. Come, I will show you how to gather what is needed." Maren rose carefully, feeling the soft ache of her muscles from sleeping on the hard floor, and followed him out of the cabin. The desert morning was crisp, with the wind carrying the scent of sage and sun-warmed sand. The warrior moved with the ease and grace of someone born to this land, and she struggled to keep pace, awed by his intimate knowledge of every rock, crevice, and shadow. "Watch the land," he instructed, pointing to a patch of brittle desert brush. "Life hides in the smallest spaces. The smallest plants, the tiniest tracks, they tell stories if you learn to read them." Maren knelt beside him, squinting at the ground. He placed a large, calloused hand near hers, guiding her fingers over subtle indentations in the sand. She felt the heat of his skin, the rough texture, and a thrill shot through her. "The desert speaks," he murmured, "and it is patient, but it tests all who enter." For hours they moved together across the rocky terrain, the warrior teaching her to gather food, find water, and read the subtle signs of life in the harsh land. Every instruction was layered with his intense presence, the air between them charged with unspoken tension and a growing, undeniable bond as the sun climbed higher. Maren realized that each moment in his presence reshaped her. The fear, the desire, the awe, they blended into something she could not name, something that would change her life forever. And in the quiet of the desert, beneath the watchful eyes of the mesas, she knew that whatever the future held, she was irrevocably entwined with the man who had brought both danger and salvation into her world. The sun hovered high over the desert, turning the sand and rock to a dazzling gold. Maren followed the Apache warrior as he moved with effortless grace through the rugged terrain, guiding her to a hidden spring tucked between jagged cliffs. Air was dry, scented with sagebrush and the faint metallic tang of the desert. She marveled at his knowledge, the way his eyes scanned the landscape, reading every subtle movement, every shadow, every whisper of wind. "This water is life," he said, kneeling at the edge of the spring. His bare chest gleamed with sweat, muscles flexing as he scooped up the cool liquid in his hands. "Drink carefully. Respect the land and it will provide." Maren knelt beside him, cupping her hands to drink. The water was crisp and refreshing, and she felt a surge of energy flow through her, a vitality she hadn't known she'd lost. She glanced at him, and for the first time since their encounter, she allowed herself to see the man beyond the warrior, the protector, the guide, the force of nature who had claimed her trust and fascination. "You've changed everything for me," she whispered. Her voice trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of realization. I didn't expect to feel this way. About you, about the desert, about myself." He turned to her, the intensity of his gaze softened by something warmer, almost tender. "You've been brave, Maren," he said. "And your heart, it is strong. That is why I allowed you here. You've earned your place in this land, in my world." The words sent a thrill through her, mingled with an ache of desire she had tried to contain. She wanted to reach for him, to bridge the distance, but the tension that had built over days of close quarters, shared lessons, and silent glances held her in place. He stepped closer, the movement slow, deliberate, the heat of his bare skin radiating toward her. "There is something between us," he murmured. "Dangerous, yes, but undeniable. You must understand that if you cross the line, there is no turning back." Maren's breath hitched, chest rising and falling rapidly. "I understand," she whispered, though her voice was barely audible over the soft rush of the spring and the whispering wind. Her heart knew the truth long before her mind did. She was already lost to him. For a long moment they stood in silence, the desert stretching endlessly behind them. Time seemed to suspend, each heartbeat amplified, each breath shared. And then, as if pulled by an invisible thread, Maren stepped forward, closing the gap. He did not retreat. His eyes held hers, a mixture of warning and invitation, and the world outside, the harsh desert. The unforgiving sun faded into irrelevance. When their hands finally met, it was electric, a jolt that traveled up her arm and settled deep in her chest. The warrior's fingers were calloused and strong, yet gentle as they brushed against hers. The tension that had defined every moment between them melted, replaced by something raw, undeniable. And eternal dot they moved to a shaded alcove by the spring, the water glinting in the sunlight, and for the first time, Maren allowed herself to surrender to the storm of emotions she had fought so hard to contain. The desert, once harsh and threatening, now felt like a sanctuary, a witness to the bond that had formed between two souls from vastly different worlds. Hours passed with quiet conversation, shared laughter, and the easy companionship that comes from survival and mutual respect. And when the sun began to dip again, painting the desert in the warm hues of evening, Maren understood something fundamental. She was no longer the same woman who had wandered into this land in fear. She was stronger, braver, and irrevocably connected to the man who had both terrified and captivated her dot as they returned to the cabin. Side by side, the Apache warrior glanced at her with a rare softness in his dark eyes. "You belong here," he said. "With me, with this land." Maren felt a shiver of anticipation and certainty. "And I want to," she replied, her voice steady, her heart full. The desert wind whispered through the rocks and sagebrush, carrying with it a promise of survival, of connection, of a love forged in the harshest of places, tempered by danger, and sealed by trust. And as the sun set behind the mesas, painting the sky in fiery oranges and deep purples, Maren and the Apache warrior knew they had found something rare and eternal, a bond that no desert, no danger, and no distance could ever break.